In September of 2008, a man named Dale Voss stood in an elevator office in Meade County, Kansas, and listened to a grain buyer named Curtis Hale explain, with the patient courtesy of someone correcting a child, that the wheat Dale was selling was not a commodity. It was a curiosity. Hale had a clipboard and a laminated price sheet, and he set both on the counter between them as he spoke. The standard number, he said, was $5.63 a bushel. That was what the elevator paid for hard red winter wheat, certified variety, contract compliant. What Dale had in his truck was neither certified nor contract compliant. It was an open, pollinated landrace variety his grandfather had carried from a farm outside Enid in 1947, a wheat his own father had forbidden him to grow on the grounds that it yielded too little and milled too slowly. Hale looked at the sample bag and said, not unkindly, that he could take it off Dale's hands at a significant discount. The figure he named was $3.90. There was another man in the office, a young merchandiser from the parent company, who had driven down from Garden City and who watched the exchange with the polite attention of someone observing a routine. After Dale picked up the bag, Hale said one more thing, with the tone of a man who is trying to be helpful and believes he is succeeding. He said that specialty crops were a fine hobby, but that in Meade County in 2008, a man needed to be positioned in the commodity market to be taken seriously by the lending community. The lending community in this county meant the elevator and the bank and the Farm Service Agency office, all of whom had been aligned on certified varieties since the late 1980s. Hobby. That was the word Hale used. Dale heard it the way you hear a word that has been applied to something you have tended for 14 years, with the same care you would give a child. He did not answer. He picked up the bag and walked out into the September light, and the young merchandiser watched him go through the plate glass window. Dale climbed into the truck and set the sample bag on the passenger seat and sat there for a moment, looking at it. Then he drove home. 14 years later, in the summer of 2022, when a global supply shock pushed hard red winter wheat to $12 and above, and most of the regional mills were scrambling to fill orders, Dale Voss sat in that same county and received a check from a stone milling operation outside Wichita for $31.40 a bushel. His farm held 40 acres of that wheat. He had not sold a bushel at anything close to commodity price in a decade, because nobody had been paying commodity price for what he grew. They had been paying more, sometimes much more. And in the year when the market finally broke wide open and the buyers started making calls they had never made before, the one farm in 3 counties with a deep inventory of a variety that had not collapsed under pressure was Dale's. This is the story of those 14 years. It is not a story about luck. Dale Voss was 52 years old in 2008, and he had been farming the same 280 acres in Meade County for 26 years. He was known for 2 things in that county, his silence and his grain. People who met him at the co-op thought the silence meant he had nothing to say. People who knew his ground understood that the silence was just the way he listened. He kept records the way his grandfather had, in a ruled composition notebook with a fountain pen, a column for rainfall, a column for soil temperature at 6 inches, a column for germination rate by field section, going back to 1982. The notebooks lived in a wooden box his grandfather had built from the boards of a chicken house. There were 31 of them by the time Curtis Hale made his offer. Let me tell you about Clemens Voss, because the whole story turns on what he left behind and what he understood. Clemens had come to Meade County from the Oklahoma Panhandle in 1947, not because life was better there, but because it was worse, and because a cousin had told him there was ground available in Kansas that a careful man could afford. He arrived with a Model A truck, a wife named Edna, and a cloth sack of wheat seed he had been selecting on the Oklahoma ground since 1931. The variety had come to his family from a neighbor who had gotten it from a Russian Mennonite community near Enola, a turkey red derivative that had been passed from farmer to farmer across the Panhandle for 20 years before Clemens acquired it. By the time he carried it to Kansas, it had been selected on Oklahoma soil for 16 years, and it was no longer exactly what the Mennonites had planted. It was something that had been shaped by Oklahoma weather and Oklahoma soil and the preferences of the farmers who had saved its best seed each year. Clemens understood that he was carrying something alive. That was how he thought of it. Not as a stored product, but as a continuing adaptation, a thing that was still becoming what the ground needed it to be. He planted his Kansas field the first autumn and watched how it established, and the notes he made that winter in a new composition book were the beginning of a record that his grandson would extend for the next 56 years. The first entry read simply, "Good germination in the north section, thin in the southwest corner where the pan layer is worst. Need to amend or tile. The seed knows this ground is different. We will learn it together. He was not a poetic man." That sentence was the most poetic thing in 31 notebooks. His father, Ray Voss, had been a practical man in the best and worst sense. Practical enough to bring the home place through the 1980s farm crisis by switching early to certified variety Jagger wheat, cutting inputs, and running a disciplined cost sheet that would have impressed any banker in Meade County. Practical enough to forbid Dale in 1994 from replanting the rows of open-pollinated heritage wheat that Dale's grandfather Clemens had maintained in a small, dedicated field since the family arrived on that ground. Ray's reasoning was sound on its face. The landrace variety, which Clemens had called Meade Red, yielded roughly 12 to 14 bushels per acre in a normal year, against the 22 to 26 a modern, certified variety could deliver. The elevator wouldn't pay a premium for it. The market had no category for it. Keeping it was sentiment. Dale had kept it anyway. He had done it quietly, moving the seed to a half-acre plot behind the machine shed after his father told him to plow it under. When Ray died in 2001, Dale moved the Meade Red back into a full 2-acre nursery, and then, over the following 5 years, expanded it to the 8 acres he was farming when Curtis Hale called it a curiosity. He did not advertise this. He simply grew it, saved a portion of the grain as next year's seed, and each year expanded the planting by whatever the seed inventory allowed. What he was not doing was being sentimental. Let me tell you about what Meade Red actually was, because the dismissal always rested on the assumption that old meant simple, and simple meant worse. Meade Red was a turkey red derivative, part of the hard winter wheat lineage that Mennonite settlers brought to the high plains of Kansas beginning in the 1870s. Turkey red and its land races were the foundation of American wheat production for 60 years. They were replaced not because they were inferior, but because the industrial milling system that expanded after the Second World War required uniformity, and landrace wheats, selected by individual farmers over decades of observation, are by definition variable. They are not uniform because they were never meant to be uniform. Each generation of a landrace wheat is the result of open pollination and natural selection within that specific field's conditions, which means the seed in Dale's plot was not the same seed Clemens had carried from Enid in 1947, but a population that had been quietly adapting to Dale's specific 65-inch elevation, his particular clay and loam subsoil, his rainfall patterns, and his frost dates for over 60 years. What you get from that, when it works, is something a plant breeder would call local adaptation, and what a farmer in Meade County would call a wheat that knows the ground. The modern certified varieties are bred for average. Meade Red had been selected, generation by generation, for this. The protein content was the first thing a careful buyer noticed. Modern, hard red winter wheat is bred to deliver consistent protein, typically in the 11 to 12% range that commodity contracts specify. Dale's grain came in at 14 to 15%, with a wet gluten reading that stone millers described as unusually extensible, meaning the dough it made stretched without tearing, which is a quality that matters enormously in certain bread-making traditions, and very little in the high-volume commercial baking that had defined the American grain market since the post-war years. The grain was also, by modern elevator standards, inconsistent. The kernel size varied. The test weight, measured in pounds per bushel, came in lower than certified varieties. Both of those things were marks against it in the commodity system. Both of those things were, in a different market, precisely the point. Dale had not found that market yet in 2008. What he had found was two small bakeries in Wichita, one operated by a woman named Sujin Park, who had come to the state from Seoul by way of a culinary program in Chicago, and who made a sourdough loaf with a crumb structure her customers described as unlike anything they had tasted in Kansas. Sujin had found Dale through a classified notice he had run in a regional farm publication. 3 lines, no description of the variety, just the protein reading, and a price that was $2.10 above elevator. She had driven to Meade County to see the field, crouched in the rows for a long time without speaking, studying the head structure, and rubbing a few kernels between her palms. When she stood up, she asked Dale how long the variety had been on this ground. He told her. She asked if anyone else was growing it. He said not that he knew. She looked at the field for another long moment and said, the way a person says something they have been waiting a long time to say, that she had been looking for this. She bought 400 pounds of whole berry grain that first season. The loaves she baked from it that autumn, a slow, open crumb sourdough she milled herself in the back of her bakery, were different enough from her other breads that her regular customers asked what had changed. She told them it was the wheat. She did not elaborate. The bread sold out each week. She came back every year after that. She never negotiated. If you know what it means to find something you have been quietly searching for, you understand why she didn't. Some things you don't negotiate. You're just grateful they still exist. Curtis Hale was not a bad man. He was a grain merchandiser who had built a 30-year career on understanding what the market would bear, and in 2008, the market bore hard red winter wheat at $5.63 a bushel, certified variety, contract compliant. The market had no line item for what Dale grew. Hale was not wrong about the elevator. He was wrong about the time horizon that would matter. Dale kept going. You might wonder, as some of his neighbors did, why a man who kept meticulous cost records and understood his margins would continue expanding a planting that yielded 12 bushels an acre when his certified ground was delivering 24. The answer is in the notebooks. Dale tracked the total revenue per acre, not the yield per acre. 12 bushels at $7.80, which was what the Wichita bakeries were paying him by 2010, was $93.60. 24 bushels at the elevator price of $5.70 was $136.80. The certified ground still won on revenue. The Meade Red was not yet a business decision. What it was in those years was an insurance policy Dale could not fully articulate. He had watched his father and the neighbors who followed the extension recommendations cycle through variety after variety, chasing the certified seed company's newest releases, each one promising better yields, better standability, better disease resistance. He had watched them spend $28 to $32 an acre on certified seed every year, because certified varieties could not be saved. The intellectual property belonging to the breeding programs, the farmer required to buy new seed each planting. He had watched the input costs climb in lockstep with the commodity price. He kept his own seed. His seed cost was zero. By 2012, he had expanded the Meade Red to 18 acres and was selling to 4 buyers, the 2 original Wichita bakeries plus a flour mill in Newton that had begun stone milling heritage wheats for a small regional market, and a chef in Kansas City who had called him out of nowhere and spoken for 20 minutes about what she needed for a pasta program she was building. The price range was running from $7.40 to $9.20 a bushel, depending on buyer and volume. The elevator price that year was $7.80. He was competitive. He was not yet a revelation. He was also, in those years, managing something his neighbors were not. Meade County received 14.3 inches of rain in 2012 against a normal of 17. The certified variety fields around him yielded 18 to 20 bushels an acre, down from their typical 24. Dale's Meade Red yielded 11. Not dramatically different. Not a visible vindication. The key difference was invisible and was not visible until later. The Meade Red population had been adapting to low moisture conditions in that ground for decades, and the root architecture it had developed, deeper and more fibrous than modern short-strawed varieties, was doing something under the soil that the yield number alone did not capture. It was building, not drawing down. The soil biology in that field was different from the surrounding certified ground. Measurably so, though Dale would not learn that from a soil scientist's report until 2016. What he knew in 2012 was that his plants had not gone dormant early, had not shattered as badly, and had set reasonable seed under conditions that had punished his neighbors' certified acres. In the spring of 2011, the Meade County Farm Bureau held its annual variety performance meeting at the VFW Hall in Fowler, and Dale went, as he usually did, to sit in the back and listen. The presenter that year was a regional agronomist from the Extension Service named Frank Aldridge, who had driven down from Dodge City with a slide deck and a case of printed handouts summarizing certified variety trial data from the past 3 seasons. Aldridge was a thorough man who believed in the data he was presenting, and the data was good data, gathered carefully from research plots across the county. He went through the yield numbers, the standability ratings, the disease resistance scores. Then someone in the middle rows, a farmer Dale didn't recognize, asked about heritage varieties, about whether any of the old open-pollinated wheats might be worth revisiting for niche markets. Aldridge pulled up the next slide, which showed a table comparing certified variety yields against unimproved landraces. He said what the data showed. Landraces yielded less. They were inconsistent. The market did not price them at a premium sufficient to offset the yield penalty. There might be specialty cases, he said, artisan bakers, that sort of thing, but the numbers did not support landrace production for a commercial operation of any meaningful scale. He used the word anomaly. He said that what looked like niche opportunity was usually hobby economics at scale. He clicked to the next slide. Dale sat in the back row with his arms on his knees and said nothing. He had his notebook in the truck. He drove home and wrote down the yield figures Aldridge had cited, because they were accurate, and then he wrote down the price Sujin had paid him that season, and the price from the Newton Mill, and did the arithmetic again in the column he kept for that purpose. His neighbor to the west, a man named Gordon Pruitt, was known in Meade County for being among the first to adopt precision agriculture technology, GPS-guided planting in 2007, variable rate fertilizer application in 2009, a new self-propelled combine in 2011 that had cost him $287,000 on a 7-year note. Gordon was not a foolish man. He was following every piece of credentialed advice available to him. And that advice was good for the system it described. He was extracting maximum efficiency from his certified variety ground. He was also, by 2012, carrying $340,000 in total operating debt against commodity prices that had been volatile enough in the wrong direction, twice in the preceding 5 years, to make the margins feel narrower than the acreage would suggest. Dale had no equipment debt. His combine was a 1979 model he maintained himself, and the per-bushel harvest cost of that old machine, imputed against his actual fixed costs, came out around 87 cents a bushel, against Gordon's estimated $1.40. Dale kept this in the notebook. He did not discuss it with Gordon. Curtis Hale came back in 2014. He drove out to the farm this time, which was different, and he brought a younger man from the elevator's parent company, a man in a pressed chambray shirt named Kevin, who had a tablet computer and spoke knowledgeably about niche grain programs. The company was exploring, Hale said, whether it made sense to offer a premium for identity-preserved heritage grain. He said the artisan flour market was showing real numbers in certain metro markets and that their parent company had been watching the heritage grain trend and believed there was a contracted volume opportunity worth formalizing. The language was precise and cheerful, the language of a system that had noticed something valuable and was now organizing to contain it. Dale showed them the notebooks. Kevin photographed several pages and asked detailed questions about protein consistency and test weight variability across seasons. Dale answered them. Hale walked the edge of the mead-red field without stepping into it, the way a man walks around something he is not sure belongs to him. He looked at the stand for a while and said it was something. He said he wished he had taken it more seriously in 2008. He said this without irony, because he was not an ironic man, just an honest one. They offered a program price of $8.50 a bushel. Elevator contracted, which would require Dale to sign over, variety rights for documentation purposes, and commit his production to the elevator's program exclusively. Dale said he would think about it. He did not call them back. The notebooks told him the answer. His direct buyer prices were already above $8.50 and rising. Sujin was paying $9.40. The Newton Mill had been at $8.90 since the previous season. More important than the price was what the contract would have required. Signing over variety documentation and committing exclusively to the elevator would mean surrendering the open pollination seed system, which was the whole mechanism. It would mean delivering a fixed genome sample of Mead Red to a company that might place it in a certification program or breed it toward traits it valued, away from the traits that 60 years of selection on this specific ground had produced. It would mean cutting off Sujin Park and the Newton Mill and the chef in Kansas City, people who had been paying him above-market prices since before the elevator, cared that above market was possible. That was not a deal, he wrote in the notebook. Elevator offer, $8.50 contracted, variety documentation required, exclusive commitment required. Declined. Current direct buyer average, $9.12. Current seed cost $0. By 2015, his granddaughter Maya had come home. She was 23 and had finished a degree in agricultural business at Kansas State, and she had arrived with a spreadsheet, a new laptop, and a certainty that her grandfather was sitting on an opportunity he was too modest to pursue at the scale it deserved. She had spent 2 semesters reading about the specialty grain market in the Northeast and had met, at a food systems conference in Salina, a specialty grain broker from Manhattan named Paul who believed that heritage wheat was a decade away from being a mainstream premium category. Paul had given Maya his card and told her that the farmers who positioned themselves now, at volume, would own the market when it matured. Maya sat at Dale's kitchen table under the hanging lamp and showed him the projections. Paul's numbers, scaled to 40 acres of Mead Red at Northeast prices, showed a gross of $171,000 annually. The capital cost to expand the planting was modest, mostly seed increase time. The opportunity was right there. He listened. He let her finish. Then he asked her how many acres of Mead Red she thought he could plant and still manage the seed increase himself, selecting each generation by hand from the field. She said the broker thought that at scale you could hire people to do that. Dale said he understood that, and asked her what happened to the variety's local adaptation when the selection was done by hired people who had not watched that field across 30 growing seasons. She did not have an answer for that one. He asked her how many seasons of seed increase that would require, starting from his current 18 acres of reliable planting stock, to reach 40 acres without compromising variety integrity. She calculated and said 4 years minimum. He said that was right. Then he asked her what she thought would happen to those Northeast premium prices if every heritage grain grower in the country planted 40 acres of heirloom wheat in the same 4-year window, because Paul's pitch had not been exclusive, and Paul had been making it at a conference where 50 farmers had been in the room. She looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. He did not press the point. He got up and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the back burner, the pot that was always going, and set one in front of her and sat back down. He said he did not want to scale. He wanted to deepen. The distinction was not about ambition. It was about what the thing actually was, a landrace variety that is scaled beyond its careful selection process, stops being a landrace variety. It becomes a product, and products can be copied and undercut and certified away from you, and then you have nothing the elevator could not have given you in 2008. There was a difference, and the difference was the whole argument. She stayed. She did not call Paul back, though she thought about it for several weeks. She stayed because something in that conversation had made her want to understand what her grandfather understood, and she suspected it would take time. If you have been watching what I am describing, you probably see what happened next, and when it happened. The structural shock did not announce itself. It arrived in the way these things do, as several overlapping pressures that each seemed manageable in isolation and were not manageable together. Frank Aldridge came back through Meade County in the autumn of 2018 for a cover crop and soil health workshop at the Fowler elevator. Dale attended. After the formal presentation, during the coffee and handshake portion, Gordon brought Aldridge over to meet Dale and mentioned that Dale was growing one of the old landrace wheats. Aldridge looked at Dale with genuine curiosity and said he had been seeing some interesting research out of Aberdeen on heritage grain flavor profiles. Then he said, with the same tone he used for everything, measured and even and informed, that the yield economics for landrace production in southwest Kansas remained challenging, that the specialty market was real but thin, and that most operations that tried it at commercial scale found the identity preservation overhead ate the premium. He said hobby, the same word Hale had used, though he said it without any condescension, simply as a category. He said it looked like a meaningful hobby. Dale thanked him and got another cup of coffee. In 2019, a stripe rust outbreak moved through the Central Plains wheat belt, a strain called YR27+ that attacked several of the most widely planted, certified varieties with particular aggression. Meade County lost a county average of 31% of its certified variety production that year. Gordon Pruitt, who was planted heavily in a single variety that had been the extension recommendation for 4 consecutive years, lost 38% of his acres to the outbreak. He had sprayed a fungicide pass in April, which had reduced the damage but not reversed it. The rust pressure was not uniform, and it followed exactly the lines that plant pathologists had warned about for years when discussing the risks of planting monocultures of genetically identical material across millions of acres. The pathogen found the vulnerability, and the vulnerability was everywhere at once because the same gene had been planted everywhere at once. Dale's Meade Red lost 9% of its effective yield to rust pressure. Not immune, not untouched. The population showed variable resistance because in an open pollinated landrace, there is always variability, and some of that variability, accumulated over decades of selection in that specific ground, expressed itself as resistance. The plants that resisted set seed. The plants that were susceptible threw a lower seed count. The field averaged 11 bushels an acre in a year when the certified ground around it averaged 14. The difference in yield was not dramatic. The difference in total field loss was significant. And in October, when Dale harvested the seed rows, he selected from the plants that had thrown the best head count despite the rust pressure, the way Clemens had taught his own son to select. And what he planted the following autumn was a population slightly better equipped to hold its own against that particular pathogen than the one that had gone in the ground the previous fall. That was the mechanism. That was the thing no certified variety could do, because you do not save certified seed, and you do not select it, and the variety that goes in the ground in year 5 is identical to the one that went in the ground in year 1, carrying the same vulnerabilities in the same proportions, waiting for a pathogen that learned to match them. Then 2020 brought a drought. Southwest Kansas received 11.8 inches of precipitation in the growing season against a normal of 17. The certified variety yields collapsed to 9 to 12 bushels per acre across most of the county. Gordon's ground averaged 8. He had a $340,000 equipment note and $48,000 in input costs against a harvest that came in just short of covering the debt service. Dale's Meade Red yielded 10. Again, not a spectacular outperformance. Again, the root architecture was doing something the yield number alone did not show. Those deep fibrous roots that had been selecting for moisture efficiency in this specific clay and loam subsoil since 1947, holding water in the rhizosphere the way the shallow-rooted modern varieties could not. His test weight per bushel came in at 63 pounds, higher than the county average despite the dry conditions. His grain quality held. Maya had been keeping the documentation by this point, adding the soil biology data from a Kansas State Extension program that had come out to core the fields in 2016 and found measurably higher mycorrhizal fungal networks in the mead-red ground than in the surrounding certified acres. The report used the phrase community-level soil ecology, which Dale wrote in the notebook and then underlined once, which was the only time he underlined anything. And then the market turned. In early 2022, a series of supply chain disruptions, compounded by poor harvest conditions in major producing regions, pushed commodity wheat prices to levels that had not been seen since 2008. The elevator price climbed through $9, through $10, through $12 a bushel. Commodity grain producers who had survived the preceding 3 difficult years on thin margins were now looking at a seller's market. And it should have been a good moment for the conventional system. It was not, because the supply was thin. The 2019 and 2020 harvests had been below average. Seed inventories were stressed, and a category of buyer that had barely existed in 2008 had grown substantially in the intervening years. A network of stone millers, artisan bakeries, specialty flour producers, and restaurant supply companies that were now purchasing identity-preserved heritage grain at premiums that existed in a different world from the commodity exchange. Those buyers were making calls to farms they had identified over years of patient sourcing. They were not calling the elevator. A man named Warren Schreck, who ran the stone milling operation outside Wichita, called Dale in May of 2022. Schreck had been buying from Dale since 2017 in volumes that had grown from 3,000 pounds to 8,000 pounds annually. He told Dale he had lost 2 of his 4 regular suppliers to the stripe rust and drought years and needed to know what Dale was carrying. Dale walked the field and came back and told Schreck he had approximately 42,000 pounds of grain he could offer from the previous harvest, plus a standing crop of 40 acres that would harvest in July. Schreck said he would take all of it. He said the price was $31.40 a bushel. Dale wrote it in the notebook. Then he sat at the kitchen table for a while, and Maya came in from checking the upper field and saw him sitting there with his pen still in his hand, and she asked him what was wrong. He handed her the notebook, open to the page where he had written the number. She read it. Then she read it again. It was not what she said next that mattered. It was the silence before she said anything, and the way she set the notebook down very carefully, as if it had become heavy, and looked out the kitchen window at the field her great-grandfather had seeded in 1947. Schreck had told him something else on the phone, something Dale had not written in the notebook, because he was still thinking about how to say it. Schreck had also called Curtis Hale's elevator to check their identity-preserved program, because he was trying to source additional volume. The elevator program had been discontinued in 2018. The variety documentation they had collected was sitting in a file somewhere and had never been planted, because the program had not generated enough contracted volume to justify the overhead. Hale himself had retired in 2016. Dale sent Maya down to the elevator in July with a sample, the way his grandfather had once sent his own son with a sample, though for different reasons. The manager there, a younger man named Travis, who had been 3 years old in 2008, looked at the protein reading and the wet gluten analysis that Schreck's mill had provided, and he asked Maya where they had been selling this grain. She told him. He said he had been hearing from buyers in Wichita and Newton about a Meade County heritage variety, and had not been able to figure out who was growing it. She said her grandfather was. He asked what they were receiving. She told him. Travis was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, with the honesty that sometimes comes to a person who is young enough not to have a previous position to defend, that he had not known this was possible in this county. Maya said that her grandfather had known. The 40 acres that came off the combine in the last week of July yielded an average of 13.4 bushels, lower than the certified variety standard and irrelevant at $31.40 a bushel. The gross on those 40 acres was $16,810. Against a cost basis that included no certified seed purchase, no synthetic growth regulator, and an input cost of $48 per acre for fertilizer and fuel, Dale netted approximately $570 per acre. Gordon Prewitt's certified acres, at the elevated commodity price of $12, against his input costs and equipment debt service, netted closer to $110 per acre. In October, Warren Schreck drove to the farm with his wife and 2 of his mill employees for a reason that had nothing to do with grain. He had brought a proposal, written out on 2 pages, for a formal seed preservation partnership that would fund a small increase in the Mead Red acreage over 5 years, document the variety's provenance and growing history, and create a contractual right of first refusal on Dale's annual production. The payment for the partnership was $14,000 per year, against which Schreck would receive the documentation and the right. Dale would retain the seed, the variety, and the flexibility to sell elsewhere if Schreck's offer in any given year fell below the market for similar heritage wheats. Dale read the 2 pages. He asked one question about the variety documentation and whether Schreck intended to file for any intellectual property protection on the lineage. Schreck said he did not. He said he had spent 20 years in this business, watching companies try to lock down varieties and watching the varieties lose something each time they were domesticated that way. He said what he was paying for was the relationship with this ground, not a legal claim on a genome. Dale signed the 2 pages. Maya took on the seed management and the documentation work, and also the relationship with 3 additional buyers she had located through the Regional Heritage Grain Network that had grown up in the decades since she had first sat at that kitchen table with her spreadsheet. She did not scale the planting beyond 40 acres. She deepened the documentation, adding soil biology data and rainfall records that created a provenance file now running to 4 volumes alongside the original 31 composition notebooks. The buyers received a printed sheet with each order detailing the variety history, the growing season notes, and the soil temperature records. Sujin Park, who was still baking sourdough in Wichita and had expanded to a second location, framed the first of those sheets and hung it on the wall near the register. 6 of Dale's neighbors came to him in the fall of 2022, after word traveled the county about the July harvest and the Schreck contract. Gordon Prewitt was among them. He sat at the kitchen table, across from the notebooks, and asked Dale how long it would take to establish a meaningful planting from Mead Red seed. Dale said 5 years to a reliable 10-acre stand that could hold its own in a bad year, less if the soil had good biology already. Gordon said he had always thought the old varieties were a dead end, that this was what the extension had told him for 30 years. Dale said he knew. Gordon said he had been wrong to believe that without asking further questions. Dale did not answer directly. He got up and went to the wooden box and came back with one of Clemens's notebooks, a 1952 book with a water-stained cover, and set it on the table, and let Gordon read the rainfall columns and the germination entries and the marginal notes in his great-grandfather's handwriting. The careful record of a man who had been paying attention to one piece of ground long enough to understand things about it that no certified program could deliver on schedule. Gordon sat with a notebook for a long time. Dale gave seed to 4 of the 6 neighbors that fall, enough to plant a quarter-acre trial on each farm, with the agreement that they would return a seed portion from each harvest. He charged them nothing for the seed. He told them what he knew about establishment and what he didn't know, and that the variety would behave differently on their ground than on his, and that the only way to learn what it would do was to watch it across seasons and keep records. He told them to get a composition notebook. 2 of them already had one. There is a thing that gets lost in discussions of agricultural efficiency, which is that efficiency is a ratio, and every ratio has a time horizon embedded in it. If you measure over one season, the certified variety wins on yield, and the win is real. If you measure over a decade that includes 1 disease outbreak, 1 drought, and 1 market dislocation, the ratio changes. If you measure over 60 years and include seed cost, soil biology, and the compounding value of a variety that has been selecting for your specific ground since your grandfather's grandfather broke that ground, the ratio changes again, and the winner is different. What a system measures and what is true are not always the same calculation. The commodity market measured bushels per acre and price per bushel at a single moment, and by those numbers, Dale Voss was always behind. He was not behind. He was running a longer calculation on a ledger that the elevator did not have a column for. Clemens had understood this. He had understood it the way people understand things they have arrived at by observation rather than instruction, which is without the vocabulary to explain it to a credential, and so he had not explained it. He had simply kept the wheat. Patience is not the same as stubbornness. It only looks that way from outside the time horizon that matters. The last time Dale walked the upper field, the morning before the July harvest, he took the dog with him, an old cattle dog named Rye who had worked that ground since she was a puppy, and who walked the wheat rows with her nose low, reading the soil. The field was golden and heavy and moving in a small wind. Dale crouched at the edge of a row and cupped a head of wheat in his palm, the way his grandfather had taught him, pressing the thumb gently along the rachies to feel the fill in the kernels. Full, dense, the kind of fill you get when a plant has had enough time and room to finish right. Rye sat beside him. The notebooks said it all, for those who could read them. The rest had always been arithmetic, patient and slow, working itself out in the only direction a thing that belongs to the ground can go.